If pharmaceutics and surgery aspects of medicine were similar in most respects to those of today in the middle of the last century, the same could not be said about psychiatry. Even in commonly known as developed countries, much within this area came from the Middle Ages. Electricity is still considered in some places to be the main panacea for complex mental disorders, while the lobotomy in most countries was cancelled just yesterday. And we are not even mentioning the fact that psyche is a taboo topic even in some highly economically developed countries. Welcome to Flip Side of History. So, as you have already probably guessed it, we will tell you today about psychotherapy and various methods in history that were used to treat patients. Let's continue. Lobotomy. We are talking about a form of psychosurgery here. Previously, it was used here and there, especially if the patient belonged to the lower classes. The doctor was not threatened by influential relatives. Any pronounced deviation, even plain kleptomania, was cured by dissecting one of the lobes of the brain, separating it from other areas of the thinking organ. Who then got up from the operating table? A man who could no longer do anything wrong or anything genius. If we evaluate the invasive intervention from this point of view, there was a benefit. But the operated man could not do anything good, simply eating, sleeping, urinating. Electroshock. We've all watched documentaries and feature films about what happened throughout the last century. Most of them, though, are based on real events. In weak discharges, the current can really help. It stimulates the right twirl. But the fact of the matter is that, without waiting for the effect of weak doses, the chief physicians of closed clinics burned the brains of poor souls with difficult-to-cure mental illnesses. In reality, the same procedure that is used to execute people in some American states today was used until recently to treat individuals. One of the most famous victims of electrotherapy is the writer Hemingway. After the healing session, he completely lost his memory, having stopped writing. How? Initially, it was only necessary to save him not even from psychiatric ailments, but from few neuroses. The writer did not know whether existence without memory could even be called life. That's why he shot himself. Snake pits. And this was used even in the 1960s, specifically in the United States. However, the word experiment is not appropriate here. The Americans borrowed the European method, known from the most advanced centuries in the field of various tortures. That is, you guessed it, since the Middle Ages. The man was tied over the pit itself, which was filled with poisonous snakes. What were the expectations of those who invented the dubious method of enlightening the soul and mind? The soul as well as mind of the patient have nothing to do with it at all. In the old days, it was believed that snakes were feared by demons. More on them will be covered below. And in modern times, they caused a strong shock, which supposedly could switch something in the brain of a crazy person like a toggle switch. What if it will help? They thought. Critical cooling. The patient, wrapped in a wet cold sheet, was placed, whether standing or lying, in a container that was filled with ice water, so that the cooled body no longer had a shock. Of course, the cooling gradually turned off not just the violent activity of the conditional psycho, but also any activity. After all, then they began to pour ice water from a hose on the body, which was completely accustomed to the cold. This, in a moderate dose though, could help against the development of cancer or harden against sinusitis, but certainly did not affect mental illnesses in any way possible. After warming up, the patient behaved as contemptible, according to medics of the time, as before. Intensification of therapy only led to death from pneumonia and etc. Designed for women. Victorian conventions created a situation in which the sexual needs of men were taken into account more. It was believed that only males having a lot of intimacy with their wives, and in case of a refusal or quarrel, even with other women, or in general for a change, could be called completely normal. Obviously a sin, but it's within the framework of something familiar. But a lady from a noble or intelligent family could not be forgiven no matter what for such behavior. Double standards were hard to understand. Such knowledge about her put an end to her reputation. She could simply be thrown out of the house, forbidden to meet with children, and etc. That is why women who were unable to cope with a slightly more active sex drive, and it was the same for everyone, it was just that the majority suppressed it, turned to Asclepius. They were diagnosed with simple hysteria, and this gave one a chance, while preserving this person's honor, to receive treatment from any psychiatrist, even a student. So what kind of treatment was this? the so-called specialist, we will tell you why, simply relieved a certain tension of the lady, giving her, you understand already what. With the help of his fingers and suitable decontaminated objects, he stimulated the secretive for others areas. There was no harm, but the husband's hands could not replace the hands of a specialist who knew anatomy very well. Bloodletting. But blood was the last time most mental illnesses were cold, even at the beginning of the 20th century, which is shock for many today. In those days, as well as now in some countries, not every corner could afford a doctor with a diploma. People were entrusted to all kinds of healers, midwives and swindlers. And in some distant villages, as in the Middle Ages, the barber acted as the only doctor. He believed as schizophrenic, at least a little bit of illness leaked out. The man was indeed calming down, but of course not from a cure, but only from draining, the onset of anemia, the nature of which was not understood here. In the end, after another bloodletting, such a patient of folk medicine passed away. He did not die like an honorable human being, but simply died like some creature, not even having the strength to walk. Devil's absorbment. For the most remote areas of the world, even in the constantly indicated period in the middle of the last century, the role of psychiatrist was performed by a sorcerer, a shaman, a Catholic padre, an Orthodox priest, or a Muslim mufti. Even the most primitive researched obsession, which any urban psychiatrist would have figured out in 5 minutes and prescribed the right treatment, was considered a reason for the expulsion process, simply diabolical entities. The exile itself could do nothing to harm the mentally ill. The terrible thing was something else, the suggestion that man had a connection with the devil. The blame for this was imposed on him. This further crippled the patient's psyche, giving his illness a special significance. Strange as it may seem at first glance, a full-fledged struggle with strong belief in religious myths reached the countryside of various countries precisely in the 1950s, and not earlier. Psychotropic drugs that are way too strong. Sadly, but the usage of substances that stimulate the production of serotonin and dopamine too sharply has not been abandoned in clinics in all countries. Of course, dubious cures don't kill, but the level of dependence on them is so incredibly strong that it leaves no chance without their use to return the effect of joy of life and calmness. Consequently, schizophrenic is simply made into a drug addict. But the thing is that such drugs require an increase in the dose all the time. Without them, a person becomes even more aggressive and lost to society than he was before that sort of treatment. Capsule. How to keep silent about the inventions of the Third Reich. Here psychiatry was driven by Hermann Göring's cousin, Matthias. In 1936, he founded the Institute for Psychological Research and Psychotherapy in Berlin. Clinics from the institution are known for bringing homosexuals here for treatment. The NSDAP considered this factor to be contagious disease capable of destroying the nation. Those who escaped were sent to a concentration camp, where they were confronted with even more experimental medicine from Mengele. Frightened people were more prone to choosing the first treatment option and not run away. Passive gay men were treated by placing a capsule with a male hormone in the groin area. Trepanation. Well, and about the most horrendous way of getting rid of mental ailments, traces of which have been found even on skulls from the Bronze Age and somewhere from the Neolithic. Some people argue that the second oldest profession was most likely not journalism, but psychiatry. People were broken off a piece of the skull carefully, which excludes war trauma or execution. As for the subsequent periods of history, artistic miniatures have been preserved, and later treatises, proving that a particle of the skull was removed precisely for the convenience of brain surgery. Anesthesia was not necessary back then. The brain doesn't have pain receptors, it only hurts when the skin is cut. But who was the first to decide that by digging into the mentioned organ with a sharp object, or by removing something spoiled from it, the Asclepios deprived a person of a headache, the desire to talk to demons, and even get rid of any aggression? Perhaps someone from the times that are described by the Old Testament, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Depictions of such recovery are found all over the world, even among the native population of Americas. Psychiatry can hardly be called an exact science. There are still too many mysteries in our brains for a specialist to say exactly what is good and what is bad for him or her. Do the terms good and bad apply to psychiatry at all? We do not know, we just guess. Such a delicate state of affairs always gives rise to the creativity of overly inquisitive minds from science, since studies of mind were, are, and most likely will be hard to understand. You were watching Flip Side of History. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to get notified when new episodes will come out and leave a like. And for now, see you in the upcoming episodes.